The station was silently bleeding oxygen. No one aboard Mir knew it yet. The station looked exactly as it always had. Its solar arrays still stretched toward the sun. Its modules remained locked together in orbit. Nothing about its silhouette suggested that anything had changed. Inside, one instrument quietly disagreed. The pressure gauge had begun to fall. Not suddenly, not violently. Just enough for the numbers to keep moving in the wrong direction. At first, there was no hole to point at. No damaged wall. No shattered window. Only a station that seemed perfectly intact, while the air sustaining everyone aboard was steadily disappearing into space. The crew could measure the loss. They could not see its source. By the time those falling numbers became impossible to ignore, whatever had caused them had already happened. The evidence existed before the explanation did. Telemetry became the crew's only reliable witness. The pressure continued to fall. Mission control and the onboard gauges agreed. The station was losing atmosphere. If nothing changed, the remaining air would last only about 30 minutes. The investigation had become a race against time. The collision was already over. The leak was not. Only then did investigators trace the evidence back to a routine cargo docking exercise. A Russian Progress cargo spacecraft, flying a manually controlled docking test, had struck the Spektr science module. The collision itself was unmistakable, but the greater danger did not announce itself with twisted metal or clouds of debris. It revealed itself through a measurement that refused to stop changing. The search narrowed toward a single place. The Spektr module. The first instinct was almost unavoidable. Find the hole. If the station was leaking air, then somewhere inside Mir there had to be torn metal, exposed insulation, or a visible stream of escaping atmosphere. That expectation made perfect sense. A damaged spacecraft should reveal its wound. It did not. The crew moved through the connected modules while the pressure continued to fall. They listened for changes in sound. They watched the instruments. They compared readings from different sections of the station. Every observation narrowed the search, but none revealed the breach itself. What they could hear was not an explosive roar. It was a persistent hiss, soft enough to disappear beneath the constant hum of ventilation fans. Easy to mistake unless they already knew the station was losing pressure. The evidence was subtle because the opening in the hull was subtle. Air was escaping continuously, not catastrophically. That distinction changed the investigation. The collision had not ripped Mir apart. It had pierced it. Telemetry increasingly pointed toward one destination. The Spektr module was no longer behaving like the rest of the station. It had become the only compartment that consistently matched the pressure loss recorded across the habitat. Another problem emerged. Separating Spektr from the rest of Mir should have been straightforward. Every module had hatches designed to isolate emergencies. Close the hatch, lock it, and preserve the atmosphere inside the remaining station. But when the crew reached the entrance, the hatch was not clear. 18 thick power and data cables crossed directly through the opening. They had been routed there during normal operations because Spektr carried 4 large solar arrays that supplied nearly half of Mir's electrical power. Those cables linked the station's primary source of electricity to the batteries and systems supporting the rest of the habitat. In ordinary times, they represented efficiency. In an emergency, they became an obstacle. The hatch could not close while those cables remained in place. Every second spent preserving the electrical network allowed more air to escape into space. Every second spent saving the atmosphere increased the likelihood that the station would lose its largest source of power. The hatch itself had changed. Only hours earlier, it had been an ordinary passage between two connected living spaces. Crew members could float through it, carrying equipment, experiments, and supplies. Air, electricity, and information all moved through the same opening without interruption. Now, it had become a decision point. The station could keep its air. Or it could keep the electrical connections running through that doorway. It could not keep both. With pressure continuing to fall, the crew reached for cutting tools. The investigation had answered one question. The leak was inside Spektr. It had created a far more difficult one. The tools waiting beside the hatch had never been intended for a choice like this. One was a heavy-duty wire cutter. The other was an onboard survival knife. Neither would repair the damage. They would make it permanent. The pressure gauges offered no room for hesitation. Air continued to escape from the station at a rate that pointed toward complete atmospheric loss in less than half an hour, if the leak remained open. The evidence no longer supported searching for the puncture itself. The only documented path left was to isolate the entire module. But the doorway still could not close. The bundles of cable crossing the hatch were thick. They carried electrical power from Spektr's 4 solar arrays. Others carried data between the scientific module and the station's core. Each had been routed through the hatch because, under normal conditions, the passage was never expected to become a pressure barrier. Now every one of them stood between the crew and survival. One by one, the crew disconnected what they could. Others could not be unplugged quickly enough. Those had to be cut. The action looked almost ordinary. Hands reached forward. Cable jackets were pulled clear. Copper conductors disappeared beneath the blades. No explosion followed. No shower of sparks filled the compartment. The station simply lost another part of itself with every severed line. The investigation changed again. Until this moment, the station's greatest loss had been invisible. Oxygen was escaping through a hole no one could see. Now the damage was visible. Freshly cut cable ends floated beside the hatch. Thick bundles that had once linked Spektr to the rest of Mir hung lifeless inside the module. The physical evidence no longer pointed only to a leaking compartment. It pointed to a station that had begun sacrificing its own systems to remain habitable. At last, the doorway was clear. The hatch swung shut. Its locking mechanism turned into place. The remaining modules were sealed away from the vacuum consuming Spektr. The pressure inside the occupied sections stabilized. The steady decline that had dominated every instrument finally stopped. The station had survived its first crisis, but only inside the sealed compartments. Beyond the closed hatch, Spektr continued to empty into space. The module that had provided science, storage, and nearly half of Mir's electrical power was now an airless shell. The hatch returned once more. Physically, it was the same circular opening the crew had floated through countless times before. Its meaning had become something entirely different. One side still contained the last breathable atmosphere aboard Mir. The other had become unreachable. Only after the pressure stabilized did the next consequence begin to reveal itself. The lights throughout the station were starting to dim. For a few moments, the pressure gauges finally stopped moving. That could have been mistaken for the end of the emergency. Instead, another set of instruments began telling a different story. Lights across Mir started to disappear. The change was subtle at first. Individual systems shut down. Displays flickered. Equipment that had operated continuously since before the collision no longer had enough electrical power to remain online. Nothing else had struck the station. No second spacecraft had arrived. Yet the station's condition continued to deteriorate. The evidence no longer pointed toward the atmosphere. It pointed toward electricity. The reason had been left behind the sealed hatch. Spektr was more than another laboratory attached to Mir. 4 large solar arrays were mounted on the module, converting sunlight into nearly half of the station's electrical supply. Before the collision, that energy flowed through the very cables the crew had been forced to disconnect or cut in order to close the hatch. When the hatch closed, those cables remained on the wrong side. The station had saved its air. It had also disconnected itself from one of its largest sources of power. The consequence spread far beyond a single dark compartment. Electricity aboard Mir was not simply used for lights. It charged batteries, powered communications, sustained life support equipment, and kept the station's orientation systems operating. Every subsystem assumed that the solar arrays would continue feeding energy into the central electrical network. That assumption had just become false. The station entered orbital darkness carrying far less stored power than its designers had ever intended. Each minute without sunlight now became more expensive. Batteries that normally bridged the night side of every orbit began draining faster than they could later be replenished. Equipment that had survived the collision now faced shutdown for an entirely different reason. The investigation had crossed another threshold. The collision had not merely damaged a module. It had broken the station's circulatory system. Electrical power no longer reached every place that depended on it. Another measurement refused to remain stable. The instruments responsible for Mir's orientation began reporting failures. These flywheel-based control systems normally kept the station pointed toward the sun without consuming fuel. As electrical power disappeared, the flywheels could no longer maintain that control. Mir slowly lost its ability to keep its solar arrays facing the very sunlight needed to recharge the batteries. The failure was now feeding itself. Less power weakened attitude control. Poor attitude control reduced solar power generation. Reduced generation left even less electricity available for the next orbit. A local impact had become a station-wide engineering crisis. Inside the modules, the change was impossible to ignore. Photographs taken after the emergency show interiors no longer brightly illuminated, but increasingly dependent on limited emergency lighting. Systems that had once operated together now existed under strict electrical rationing. The habitat still floated in orbit, but much of its normal capability had quietly disappeared. The sealed hatch returned again. Nothing about its appearance had changed. Its locking wheel remained fixed. The cut cable stubs still protruded from the barrier. Now they represented something new. They were no longer evidence of the station's decompression. They were evidence of the moment Mir permanently surrendered almost half of its electrical strength. Only then did the investigation turn away from the station itself. The next question was no longer how the collision had happened. It was why the station had been placed in a situation where one docking exercise could trigger such a chain of failures. The collision itself had already been reconstructed. The pressure loss was documented. The severed cables were visible. The blackout followed exactly as the electrical system predicted. One question still refused to settle. How had a routine cargo docking exercise been allowed to threaten the entire station? The simplest explanation was easy to accept. A pilot made a mistake. After all, the cargo vehicle had struck the station. Human error seemed sufficient to explain the disaster. The investigation did not stop there. Mission records showed that the approaching spacecraft was not using its normal automated docking system. Instead, it was being flown manually through the Toru remote control system during a controlled exercise. That detail changed the case. The crew was no longer recovering from an unpredictable equipment failure. They were living through the consequences of an operation that had intentionally accepted greater risk. The automatic radar guidance system that normally brought cargo ships safely to the station was absent from this approach. The spacecraft depended instead on manual commands transmitted from inside Mir. That meant distance, closing speed, and alignment all had to be judged through camera images, instrument data, and delayed human reactions. The closer the vehicle came, the smaller the margin for correction became. Evidence from the investigation pointed toward a chain rather than a single mistake. The cargo craft drifted off its intended path. Corrective commands arrived. They were no longer enough. By the time the relative motion became unmistakable, there was insufficient distance remaining to prevent contact. The impact was no longer avoidable. The reconstruction weakened the idea of a simple piloting error. The collision emerged instead as the final link in a system already operating with reduced safety margins. Another documented decision widened the picture. The manual docking exercise had not been conducted simply for training. Program managers were also evaluating procedures that could reduce operational costs by relying less on automated hardware. The investigation records do not support the claim that budget concerns alone caused the accident. They do show that institutional decisions shaped the conditions under which the accident became possible. The evidence had shifted again. Responsibility could no longer be assigned to the final seconds before impact. It extended backward through planning, operational assumptions, and engineering choices made long before the spacecraft ever approached Mir. The station itself reflected those choices. The sealed Spektr hatch remained locked. The cut cable ends still disappeared into a module that could no longer be entered. Nothing about that barrier revealed whether the critical decision had been made minutes before the collision or months before launch. Yet every consequence on the station still led back to it. The investigation was no longer asking who struck Mir. It was asking how an orbital laboratory designed for survival had become vulnerable to a single documented sequence of decisions. The answer would not be found in the damaged module. It would appear in the years that followed, as engineers tried to keep a permanently wounded station alive. Engineers eventually found a way to keep Mir alive. They never restored it to what it had been. The Spektr module remained sealed for the rest of the station's operational life. Behind the hatch, the compartment that had once housed scientific equipment, supplies, and one of Mir's largest power sources stayed exposed to vacuum. The original emergency had ended in minutes. Its consequences lasted for years. The investigation now shifted from survival to endurance. Could the station recover from losing almost half of its electrical capacity? Maintenance logs and later mission records showed a different reality. The remaining systems were continually adapted to compensate for what had been lost. Electrical power had to be managed more carefully. Scientific operations became more constrained. Every future mission inherited the consequences of a collision that no longer appeared on the daily schedule, yet continued shaping every decision made aboard the station. The hatch returned once again. It looked unchanged. The circular locking wheel remained in place. The custom metal sealing plate covered the opening. The cut ends of cables still emerged from the barrier before disappearing into darkness beyond. But the object had changed one final time. It was no longer an emergency door. It had become a permanent wall. The scientific module beyond it was no longer part of the station the crew inhabited. It existed as dead volume, orbiting alongside them, but forever inaccessible without another major engineering intervention. Engineers refused to leave the problem unanswered. Spacewalks were organized to understand exactly what the collision had done to the station's exterior. Working outside Mir, crews searched for the puncture hidden beneath insulation blankets and structural hardware. They documented the damage as accurately as conditions allowed, and evaluated whether any practical repair could restore the compartment. The inspections confirmed the reality of the wound. They did not erase it. Some uncertainty remained. The precise, microscopic shape of the original tear could never be completely reconstructed from the emergency itself. During the crisis, no one had seen the puncture form. The crew had inferred its existence from falling pressure, not direct observation. Even afterward, the earliest moments of the failure remained hidden behind the evidence that survived it. That distinction mattered. The investigation never relied on dramatic images of air rushing through a gaping hole, because none existed. Instead, the case rested on telemetry, photographs of the sealed hatch, engineering schematics, maintenance records, and the physical consequences that followed every verified step. Pressure fell. The hatch closed. The cables were cut. The power disappeared. The station lost orientation. Each observation confirmed the one before it. By the time Mir approached the end of its service life, the Spektr module still remained part of the station's structure. Yet operational planning increasingly treated it as unusable mass rather than working habitat. The wound created during that single docking exercise had become part of the station's permanent design. The hatch made its final appearance. At the beginning of this investigation, it was simply a passage connecting two living spaces. During the emergency, it became the boundary between breathable air and vacuum. After the cables were severed, it became the point where the station sacrificed electrical strength to preserve life. Now it remained as something quieter. A sealed bulkhead carrying the visible evidence of an irreversible engineering decision. Mir continued orbiting Earth after the collision. That survival is often remembered as proof that the station overcame the accident. The documented record tells a narrower story. The collision was never completely repaired. It was contained. And for the rest of Mir's life in orbit, the sealed hatch of the Spektr module remained a visible reminder that the station had survived only by accepting permanent damage.